A morning of horror in Aurora, Colorado. It was a quiet Monday morning, just like any other, in the suburban neighborhoods of Aurora, Colorado. The sun peeked over the horizon, filtering through the soft green leaves of tall oak trees lining Quincy Lane. Birds chirped their usual songs, and the hum of early risers preparing for their day drifted through the air. The small community on the city's outskirts was known for its calm streets, white picket fences, and postcard-perfect homes where just about everyone knew each other, at least by face, if not by name. However, something about that particular morning felt off. "Oh my God, do you smell that?" whispered Karen Blake, a local who was taking her routine early morning jog along Quincy Lane. She stopped abruptly, placing her hands on her hips as she glanced around in confusion, sniffing the air. Karen wasn't alone in noticing it. Children cycling to the nearby Memorial Park complained to their mothers, local shop owners stepped outside their stores, and walkers with their dogs tugged on leashes anxiously as their pets seemed unusually agitated. The smell, at first faint and puzzling, soon grew overpowering by mid-morning. It was acrid and putrid, clinging stubbornly to the cool summer breeze. Some remarked that they had never encountered anything like it. It was far too strong to be a dumpster left unemptied and much too nauseating to be from the usual animal-related issues nearby. "Maybe a sewer leak?" suggested one passerby, but no one could pinpoint the source. As curiosity turned to unease, a small group of neighbors, including Karen, gathered to discuss. "It seems to be getting stronger toward the trees near the creek," noted Robert Hale, a retired firefighter who lived just down the block. Holding the lead of his black Labrador, Rex, who by now had become restless, Robert gestured toward a trail leading to an old overgrown lot, nestled alongside a small creek behind the neighborhood. The lot had been unused for years, often seen as the kind of eerie space that kids spun spooky tales about at Halloween. Most avoided it. "Should we take a look?" Karen hesitated, her voice slightly shaky. She glanced around at the group, which had grown to about 10 residents, each seemingly battling the same mix of nerves and curiosity. "This is definitely not normal," interjected Alice Lowry, a longtime resident in her 60s, clutching a worn scarf tightly against her nose. "I mean, Quincy Lane has never smelled like this. If it's dead wildlife, it's something big." "Come on," muttered Robert, pulling a flashlight from inside his jacket. He often joked about being over-prepared for anything, even in retirement, but that morning, no one was laughing. The group followed behind him cautiously, arms folded, some nervously glancing over their shoulders, as though any moment someone or something might jump out of the dense brush of the overgrown lot. The smell intensified as they wove through a narrow dirt trail veiled by years of untended weeds. Some gagged openly now, covering their noses with sleeves or scarves. "It's horrible," whispered Erica Willis, a high school teacher whose face had flushed a deep red from holding her breath. The creek bubbled faintly nearby, a faint soundtrack to the tense atmosphere. Finally, the group reached a clearing where the ground was notably uneven. Several fresh small mounds of dirt stood out unnaturally against the untouched greenery around them. "Robert, look!" Karen whispered, pointing toward one of the mounds. There was something strange about it. It wasn't just dirt, it looked recently disturbed, sloppily shoveled and tamped unevenly. On closer inspection, what appeared to be clumps of dark, damp soil stuck to tufts of fabric peeking just barely above the surface. Something wasn't right. "Did somebody bury something here?" Robert muttered aloud, scanning the area with the beam of his flashlight despite the daylight filtering through the leaves. He bent down, frowning as Rex growled lowly, sniffing the edge of the nearest mound. Someone behind him let out a tight gasp as the flashlight's glow revealed a small clump of hair. Human hair. "No! No way!" Karen stammered. Robert, with steady hands, carefully used a stick to disrupt the top layer of loose soil on the mound. What he unearthed stopped everyone cold. Streaks of yellowed bone jutted out against the dirt. Tangled within it was a piece of flesh, decayed and greenish-brown, clinging as though time had tried to erase it but hadn't yet succeeded. "Oh my God!" screamed Alice, stepping back as quickly as her trembling legs allowed. Several others gasped audibly, some choking back their nausea while others instinctively reached for their phones. Karen clutched at her mouth, her face frozen in horror. "Call the police, now!" Robert commanded grimly. Rex barked sharply as if sensing an unseen threat while everyone stood rooted to the spot, their instincts arguing between fleeing and investigating further. It wasn't long before the sound of sirens echoed across Quincy Lane, breaking the morning silence and shrouding Aurora in an eerie unease. Patrol cars, crime scene vans, and forensic specialists arrived in rapid succession, pulling yellow caution tape around the lot's entrance. Reporters, tipped off by curious scanners, began trickling onto the scene, capturing glimpses of a story that would soon grip the entire country. Aurora's peaceful suburb, once defined by PTA meetings and block parties, was about to become synonymous with one of the most gruesome discoveries in Colorado's criminal history. A series of gruesome discoveries. Aurora, Colorado, had never seen a morning like this. By the time the first wave of shock subsided, yellow police tape crisscrossed the once quiet lot by the creek, marking it as a crime scene. Officers moved methodically, their gloves snapping on as they began the grim task of investigating the mysterious mound of dirt that had horrified the residents. The initial discovery of what appeared to be human remains refused to leave anyone's mind. "Detective, you're going to want to see this," Officer Mason called out, his voice heavy with urgency as he knelt near another mound just a few feet from the first. Detective Laura Grayson, a seasoned investigator known for her no-nonsense demeanor, strode over briskly, her boots crunching against the uneven ground. "What have you got?" she asked, her tone clipped but betraying a hint of unease. Mason used his gloved hand to carefully brush away the loose topsoil. Emerging from the dirt was another horrifying sight, a scrap of fabric, pale and discolored, clinging to what looked like skeletal remains. The size of the bones suggested they didn't belong to the same body as the first discovery. Grayson let out a slow, measured breath. "Jesus, this isn't just one body, this is something else." 2 mounds, 2 sets of remains. And they weren't done. By midday the scene had transformed into a chaotic hub of activity. News of the grisly find had spread like wildfire, and reporters with their vans and cameras jockeyed for position outside the taped-off perimeter. Neighbors hovered in tight groups on the sidewalk, whispering animatedly and glancing uneasily at the officers with shovels and tools combing through the lot. "Do you think it's more bodies?" Karen Blake, still shaken from her morning discovery, asked one of the neighbors she had run into earlier. Her voice wavered as she hugged her arms tightly around her chest. "If it's not, then what the hell is it?" Danielle Warner replied, her tone sharp, more out of fear than aggression. "I mean, who buries 1 body in a place like this? 2's already too much. What if there's even more?" By the time afternoon rolled around, Danielle's grim assumptions started to seem horrifyingly accurate. Working with care, forensic teams uncovered 4 more mounds, spread across the overgrown lot like morbid pieces of a puzzle. Each mound revealed fragments of a nightmare: skeletal bones, decomposing tissues, scraps of clothing, and personal items whose presence underscored the victim's humanity. Detective Grayson rubbed her temples as she stood at the edge of the lot, staring at the scene unfolding before her. A crime scene photographer snapped shot after shot while specialists carefully cataloged every harrowing detail. The heat of the midday sun bore down on the team, but the gruesome nature of their discoveries had chilled everyone to their core. "This is no accident," she muttered to herself. "This is a graveyard. Someone's been dumping bodies here like it's no big deal." Her partner, Detective Andre Simmons, approached with a grim expression. 5 mounds so far, and the dogs are picking up on another scent near the tree line." Grayson looked at him sharply. "Another one?" "Yeah, same depth, same size. My guess? A pattern," Simmons said, his arms crossed. His usually calm demeanor couldn't hide the anger simmering beneath the surface. By now, experts were moving through the area with ground-penetrating radar, searching for soil disturbances that might indicate even more graves. From the lot's edge, the faint whine of dogs barking broke through the steady rhythm of shovels digging. Everyone knew what it meant. "Detective Grayson!" one of the handlers called out, waving her over. "We've got another hit! 2, actually!" "What the hell is this place?" Grayson muttered under her breath, pulling at her collar as she marched toward the handler. By the time dusk began to fall, 9 distinct graves had been identified. Each one was shallow, hastily dug, and hauntingly aligned in a way that suggested something more than coincidence. Grayson's worst fears were coming true, 1 mound at a time. As the team worked to excavate and document each site, an eerie quiet settled over the previously bustling progress. The air itself seemed heavy with unspoken dread. "Detective," Simmons finally said as he joined her near the edge of the growing graveyard. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped under the weight of long hours of grim discoveries. 9 bodies. This isn't just some random dump job. Whoever did this, they came back. over and over. Grayson nodded, her eyes scanning the now visible mounds that betrayed the violence hidden beneath Aurora's tranquil facade. "This wasn't spur of the moment," she said, shaking her head as if in disbelief. "This was calculated, cold-blooded." Across the street, Karen and several other neighbors had congregated, their murmurs growing more frantic as they pieced together what little they could overhear. "How many now?" one woman asked, clutching her phone tightly as though the weight of the answer might crush her. "God, I heard 9! 9 bodies!" Danielle exclaimed, her voice pitching higher with each word. "Who the hell does something like that? And right here? Right under our noses?" But the reality was beginning to sink in for everyone. The neighborhood had unknowingly harbored a nightmare for years. What began as a foul morning smell had spiraled into the discovery of one of the largest crime scenes Aurora and possibly Colorado had ever witnessed. Detective Grayson turned to Simmons as the last light faded from the sky. "We need to figure out who these people were, and fast. Because whoever did this, they're not done. You don't kill like this and just stop." Together they prepared to delve into 9 lives now connected not by who they were, but by how their paths had crossed with someone capable of unspeakable evil. Identifying the victims, who were they? Hours had turned into days since the first body was unearthed at the now infamous lot in Aurora. The once quiet suburb had become a magnet for media trucks, flashing cameras, and curiosity-driven onlookers. Tentative yellow police tape cordoned off the area, and officers stood like sentinels, shooing off anyone trying to get too close. Meanwhile, inside the forensic command tent set up near the lot, tensions ran high as detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle of the 9 victims. Detective Laura Grayson stared at the whiteboard in the corner of the cramped tent, where scattered notes, evidence photographs, and scribbled names cluttered the space in no particular order. She took a deep breath, fumbling with the pen in her hand. "We need to know who these people are," she said aloud, scanning the room for insights. "If we don't figure out their identities, we can't even begin to unravel how they ended up here, or why." Dr. Megan Ross, the lead forensic examiner, folded her arms across her chest as she flipped through a clipboard of preliminary findings. "This isn't as simple as just finding a wallet in a pocket and calling next of kin," she explained. "The remains are in different stages of decomposition. Well, they've been here for months, maybe longer." Grayson leaned against the table, the weight of the case evident from the tightness in her jaw. "Then where do we start? Anything? Did you turn up anything on that first body? Clothing, scars, dental records, personal items? Hell, I'll take shoelaces at this point." Ross slid a black and white photo across the table. "You'll want to see this. The first body we recovered had a scrap of fabric stuck to the remains. It was part of what looks like a floral cotton dress, possibly casual summer wear. Subtle, but..." She paused, tapping at the picture. "The pattern and cut tell me it was likely made in the late 80s or early 90s. Medium size, meaning it's probably a female victim in her 30s to 50s. "Guess that narrows it down," Detective Andre Simmons muttered sarcastically as he stepped closer, running a hand through his graying hair. His attempt at humor fell flat. "Any chance we can match that to someone in missing persons?" "We'll try," Grayson interjected with determination. "But honestly, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack." Ross gestured toward another tray on the forensic table. Bone fragments, teeth, and scattered personal effects were methodically laid out before them. "There may be something here. This bone damage suggests trauma pre-mortem. We're talking violent force. Multiple stab wounds judging by the flat punctures across what's left of the ribcage." "Jesus," Simmons muttered under his breath. Grayson, meanwhile, had yet to take her eyes off the skeletal remains. "And then there's this," Ross added, holding up a small Ziploc bag. Inside was a tarnished gold necklace with the letters EH, engraved on a tiny heart-shaped pendant. The fragile chain had been partially snapped, as if yanked off in a struggle. "We traced this through local jewelry store records, and we've got a name, a tentative ID." "Let me guess," Grayson said, her voice hollow, already bracing herself. "Elizabeth Harper," Ross confirmed. "Age 45, lived less than 2 miles from here on Poplar Street." The atmosphere in the room shifted, darkening as her name hung in the air. The neighbors had already whispered about Elizabeth, about how she and her elderly mother had seemed to disappear overnight months ago. The connection to the first set of bones wasn't shocking, but hearing her name out loud made it real. "What about her mother, Dorothy?" Simmons asked, sitting straighter now. "Any sign of—" "Not yet." Ross's hesitation spoke volumes. She flipped through more notes and photographs. "We're still running tests on some of the other remains. There's an older skeletal structure in there. If I had to guess, I'd bet it's Dorothy Harper, but it'll take another day or two to make a formal ID. Grayson sighed, pacing the length of the tent. Okay, that's 2 victims we can probably account for, but what about the others? We have 7 more bodies, for God's sake. We can't just keep calling them male #1 and female #3. Anything else? Ross grimaced as she slid another photo across the table. It depicted a broken pair of eyeglasses, one frame bent so severely that the lens had popped out. We found this near the 3rd set of remains. Male, mid-20s to early 30s based on the bone structure. No ID yet, but the glasses might help. Grayson stopped pacing, focusing on the photo intently. Let's check with optometrists in the area, she said. Maybe someone had a prescription for those. It's a long shot, but God knows we need one. Simmons grabbed a notepad and began jotting things down, his tone growing more curious. What about distinguishing tattoos, scars, piercings, birthmarks? Ross nodded and flipped another page on her clipboard. One of the female victims, mid-20s, has a butterfly tattoo just below her ankle. The ink's degraded, but it's clear enough to make out the pattern. It's definitely something specific. Might help narrow her down. And, oh wait, there's more. She lowered her voice as she spoke. This victim, young female, had bruising around the wrist bones. Prolonged, binding marks. Simmons cursed softly, his pen halting mid-note. The reality of the case was sinking in deeper now. These weren't random killings. These people had suffered. Anything on the men? Grayson asked, hoping to shift the conversation away from the growing pit of horror in her gut. Ross glanced back at the skeletal remains, tray #7, one of the more deteriorated male bodies. There's evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull on one of them, and another, probably mid-40s, has an old arm fracture that healed improperly. Could be from manual labor or a hard life. It's a profile we'll need to work with. The room fell silent for a beat, each member of the team absorbing the mounting weight of the case. The victims, spanning different backgrounds, ages, and walks of life, were slowly becoming more than just nameless bodies. They were people, stolen from their families and discarded like garbage in a shadowy graveyard. Grayson finally broke the silence. Let's get this organized. I want every missing person case in Aurora and the surrounding counties from the last 5 years pulled immediately. I don't care if it's a long shot or a mismatch. If someone disappeared, we need to know about it. Simmons stood and made for the exit. On it, I'll call the station. And, Megan, Grayson added, turning back to the forensic examiner, keep those DNA swabs rolling. We need results, even partial ones. Anyone still holding on to hope that their family member is alive deserves to know the truth, no matter how ugly it is. Ross nodded grimly. You'll have them. But, Laura... She hesitated for a moment before locking eyes with the detective. If this really is what it's starting to look like, if this site holds even more bodies, we might be looking at one of the worst serial cases in Colorado history. Grayson's expression hardened. Then we better be ready to catch whoever's behind it. Spotlight on number 14 Poplar Street. It didn't take long for the whispers among neighbors to converge on one particular location, number 14, Poplar Street. The modest brick house standing quietly at the end of a suburban street had suddenly become the nucleus of suspicion for everyone in the neighborhood. To most people in Aurora, it had always been the Harper house, home to Elizabeth Harper, her elderly mother Dorothy Harper, and occasionally her niece Lila Harper. But now, the seemingly ordinary home was at the center of one of the most shocking cases the town had ever seen. Detectives Laura Grayson and Andre Simmons approached the house late in the afternoon, escorted by 2 uniformed officers. The sky above had turned a murky gray, casting long, eerie shadows across the empty driveway and overgrown front yard. Grayson glanced at Simmons as they stood at the gate. You feel that? She asked, gripping the strap of her shoulder bag. Her voice carried a hint of unease. Feel what? Simmons replied with his usual stoic demeanor. This house. Grayson gestured toward the house with a sharp nod. Something about it. Like it's holding its breath. Simmons smirked faintly but said nothing. He knew better than to dismiss her instincts. They'd led them to breakthroughs in more than one case before. The team rang the doorbell and knocked several times, but there was no response. The house stood silent. The curtains were drawn tightly. It felt like the house itself didn't want to be noticed. Neighbors say it's been quiet like this for days, Simmons said, skimming through his notepad. Elizabeth Harper hasn't been seen in over 2 months, Dorothy even longer. As for Lila Harper, he trailed off, flipping a few pages. Apparently she was here off and on, but no one's seen her for at least a week before this mess started. Grayson frowned. chewing on the end of her pen as she surveyed the exterior. "What about suspicious activity? Anybody coming or going?" "One neighbor mentioned hearing shouting late at night about a month ago," Simmons said without looking up. "Another one claimed they saw a man leaving the house late one evening a few weeks back. Mid-40s, tall, slight limp, claims he looked agitated." "That man," Grayson muttered, her mind jumping to the name circulating quietly among the detectives. Roger Kane, Elizabeth Harper's ex-husband, with a history of domestic violence and a motive darker than the night itself. If anyone could connect the dots to the bodies in that field, the dots seemed to lead straight to him. Grayson glanced back at the two officers. "All right, this place isn't giving us anything shutting ourselves out here, let's get a warrant." Inside the house. An hour later, armed with the necessary paperwork, the detectives returned to the house with a locksmith in tow. The front door creaked open and immediately, it was clear that something was wrong. The interior of the house was cold and oppressive, carrying a faint, acrid smell of mildew mixed with something far worse, a metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. "Jesus," Simmons muttered as he stepped inside and flicked on a flashlight. "It smells like something died in here." Grayson didn't respond. Her eyes were glued to the living room walls, where a series of family photos hung, slightly crooked and covered in a layer of dust. Most of the photos were of Elizabeth and Dorothy, but one photo stood out, a younger man with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes, standing stiffly next to Elizabeth in what looked like a hastily posed family portrait. The frame was cracked, and a shard of broken glass lay glittering below it. "Is that Roger?" Grayson asked aloud, tilting her head to study the man in the photo more closely. "Has to be," Simmons replied, his voice low as he pointed to a small shelf beneath the photo. A discarded eviction notice was tucked there, along with a pile of unopened mail. "Looks like money trouble, too." As the team moved further into the house, they were met with signs of chaos. Chairs were overturned, drawers were pulled out and left ajar, and the faint smell of bleach seemed to waft faintly from the direction of the kitchen. The entire house had the look of a place that had seen violence, panic, and abandonment. Grayson stopped short in the kitchen doorway. "Oh God," she said, lifting her arm to cover her nose. The kitchen floor was stained in several places with dull, brownish-red marks. Blood, it was unmistakable, even in its faded state. Near the sink, a mop sat in a bucket filled with murky water, as though someone had tried and failed to clean up a scene they desperately wanted to disappear. "Get this photographed," Grayson instructed the officers, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her gut. "I want every inch of this place combed, understood?" "Yes, ma'am," one of the officers responded sharply, already clicking the shutter on his camera. The upstairs. While the evidence downstairs painted a grim picture, it was the upstairs bedrooms that delivered the first solid breakthrough. In one room, presumed to have been Elizabeth's, there were signs of life suddenly and jarringly interrupted. A suitcase was half-packed on the bed, clothes spilling out onto the floor. A journal sat open on the nightstand, its most recent entry dated 3 months earlier. It read, in Elizabeth's neat handwriting, "Roger showed up again last night, drunk as usual. I don't think he even remembers breaking into the house last week. Mom says we need to get away, but where? He's already taken everything." Grayson's stomach twisted as she read the words aloud to Simmons. "He was threatening her," Simmons said flatly. "Sounds like he knew his money troubles were catching up with him and he was spiraling." "Not just money," Grayson replied, thumbing through more journal pages. "There's something here about him forging documents. Life insurance policies, inheritance filings. He was in deep." In another bedroom, likely Dorothy's, there was little of note besides the eerie silence of a room that had been left untouched for weeks. But in the closet, stacked precariously on the top shelf, Simmons found one lead, a shoebox filled with paperwork, many of which bore Roger Kane's signature. It appeared to be a trail of fraud and failed promises, neatly hidden away, until now. A dark connection emerges. By the time the forensic team finished documenting the scene, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. Every room in the house seemed to whisper the same story. Desperation, violence, and a growing likelihood that the Harper family had been entangled in something far darker than anyone outside their walls could have imagined. Back in the living room, Simmons stood staring at the cracked photo of Roger Kane. "You think he did it?" he asked Grayson, nodding toward the photo. "If he didn't, he sure as hell knows who did," Grayson replied. He had the motive, the history, and every reason to make sure Elizabeth, Dorothy, and anyone else who could testify against him disappeared. Her words hung heavy in the air. But it wasn't just Elizabeth and Dorothy who were gone now. There were 6 other victims out there, people whose stories were still a mystery. The house at 14 Poplar Street, eerie and cold as it was, felt like the epicenter of something much larger, and Grayson knew that to uncover the truth, they would have to drag every dark secret it held out into the light. Digging deeper. The secrets of the Harper family. The Harper family had always been something of a mystery to their neighbors. They weren't exactly reclusive, but they weren't outgoing either. No one on Poplar Street could say they really knew Elizabeth Harper, her elderly mother Dorothy, or Elizabeth's young niece Lila. People occasionally saw them tending to their yard or exchanging polite hellos in grocery store aisles, but otherwise, they kept to themselves. As Detective Laura Grayson dug deeper into their lives, however, it became clear that their ordinary facade masked a whirlwind of troubles far more complicated than anyone on Poplar Street had imagined. Tracing the Harper family's trail. Standing in their makeshift command center, Grayson and her partner, Detective Andre Simmons, pored over the mountains of reports, forensic evidence, and testimony from neighbors. The tent buzzed with activity around them. Phones rang, officers shuffled through papers, and the smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air. "All right," Grayson began, rubbing her temples as she stared at the whiteboard in front of them. "What do we know so far? Let's get the basics out there." Simmons scanned his notepad, his brow furrowed. Elizabeth Harper, 45, lived here all her life, divorced from Roger Kane 8 years ago. No criminal history, no big red flags, worked part-time at a law office downtown. The neighbors say she was quiet, polite, but... He paused, tapping the pen against his pad. "But what?" Grayson prompted. "But everyone seems to remember her looking tired, worn down, more in the last couple of years." Grayson nodded, jotting notes of her own. "And her mother?" "Dorothy Harper, 72, widow, regular churchgoer until about a year ago when she supposedly stopped leaving the house except for doctor appointments. Not much to say otherwise, except a couple of neighbors mentioned hearing some yelling from their property a few months ago." "Yelling?" Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Between her and Elizabeth?" Simmons shook his head. "Doesn't sound like it. It was late at night. One time the neighbor said it sounded like a man's voice, maybe Roger?" Grayson frowned and leaned on the table. "Roger Kane keeps coming up." "Yeah," Simmons admitted. "Ex-husband. History of domestic violence. I don't have to tell you how common it is for things to escalate after divorce." He flipped to another page in his notebook. "He had a suspicious assault charge dismissed 6 years ago. His lawyer argued self-defense. And get this, he declared bankruptcy last year, lost his business, and according to the public record, he was in deep with loan sharks. Guy's sinking financially." "Sounds like a time bomb waiting to explode," Grayson muttered. She tapped her pen impatiently. Roger had been her gut instinct since the beginning, but they didn't have enough, at least not yet. "And Lila?" she asked, changing gears. "Lila Harper, 23 years old, Elizabeth's niece. Moved in with them after her parents died in a car accident when she was a teenager. Worked part-time at the Aurora Public Library. People describe her as sweet, shy, kind of naive. She was still living in the house with Elizabeth and Dorothy. Last confirmed sighting of her was 2 weeks ago by one of her co-workers. She said Lila mentioned that her uncle had been visiting." "Uncle," Grayson repeated carefully. "That'd be Roger." "Bingo," Simmons said, "uncovering secrets in the Harper home." The deeper the detectives looked into the Harper family, the stranger their circumstances became. Late that evening, after most of the team had packed up for the night, Grayson and Simmons reviewed the materials pulled from number 14 Poplar Street. "What the hell is this?" Simmons asked, holding up a shoebox he'd brought from the house's upstairs closet. Inside were stacks of papers, some old and yellowed, others more recent. Grayson carefully removed a handful of documents, her sharp eyes scanning the faded ink and hurried signatures. "Life insurance policies?" she murmured, lifting one out for closer inspection. "2 of them, one for Dorothy, one for Elizabeth. Both signed by Roger Kane as a beneficiary." "Wait," Simmons interjected, peeking over her shoulder. "Since when is an ex-husband the beneficiary? That doesn't make any sense." "Unless," Grayson added darkly, "those signatures were forged." They worked quietly under the glow of the task lamps, sifting through what felt like endless paperwork. Each new discovery seemed to add a layer of grime to the already sinister narrative. There were legal disputes, accusations of debt, and cryptic financial transactions that didn't add up. "Look at this," Grayson said, her voice tight as she handed Simmons another page. "Power of attorney paperwork for Dorothy, signed last year. Guess who it gives authority over her estate?" Simmons didn't have to guess. "Roger," he said bitterly. "And this one," she added, handing him another sheet, "a signed contract agreeing to sell the house on Poplar Street." What the? Simmons started, shaking his head in disbelief. Was Elizabeth going to sell the house? Or was this another forgery? Jesus, it's like the guy was planning to bleed them dry. Grayson's face hardened as she stared at the damning pieces of paper. Roger wasn't just a threat. He was systematically cutting off every financial escape route they had. He wasn't just abusive, he was strategic. This wasn't desperation, this was calculated. The last straw. As dawn broke the next morning, the detectives sat with their coffees in the command tent, their faces lined with exhaustion. The pieces of the case so far pointed to one inescapable conclusion: the Harpers had been trapped, financially, emotionally, and maybe even physically, by Roger Kane. But was his motive clear enough to link him to the bodies in the lot? And where, in all of this, was Lila? I keep coming back to the neighbors, Simmons said, flipping through his notes again. More than one of them mentioned seeing him at the house late at night in recent months, and then there's the shouting they've heard. What if that's when everything started to spiral? Grayson looked up, her eyes sharp despite her fatigue. If Roger was threatening the Harpers, if he killed Elizabeth and Dorothy to cover his tracks with the forgeries, why does Lila disappear after all this? I've been thinking about that too, Simmons said flatly. Maybe she figured it all out. Maybe she saw something she wasn't supposed to. Grayson didn't like where his theory led. If Lila had discovered Roger's plan, would he really spare her? Or was she the youngest victim? The girl with the butterfly tattoo, bruises on her wrists, just another life silenced by Roger Kane's tangled web? Let's bring him in, Grayson said, her tone steely as she rose to her feet. It's time Roger Kane answers for what the hell went on in that house. A stranger emerges from the shadows. For the neighbors on Poplar Street, the mention of a certain man in connection to the Harper family wasn't the shock it should have been. Even before the detectives knocked on doors for interviews, whispers had already started circulating of a strange man seen lingering in the area over the past few months. He wasn't a friendly face on the block. There were no waves or polite hellos exchanged. What made him even more memorable was his distinct limp, his broad shoulders hunched as though carrying the weight of the world, and the sharp, cold glint in his eyes that unnerved anyone who looked too long. That's him, Mrs. Callahan said with certainty, gripping the edge of her screen door tightly, as Detective Andre Simmons showed her a picture of a man in his late 40s. The image was from an old arrest file the detectives had pulled up earlier that morning. Roger Kane. I saw him a couple of times out there, just lurking, always late at night, thought it was strange, but I figured, well, none of my business. When exactly did you last see him, ma'am? Simmons asked, his tone steady but insistent. He had learned that even the most benign details could blow a case wide open. Mrs. Callahan furrowed her brow, thinking hard. I want to say, maybe April? Yeah, right before Easter. He was standing by the Harper's yard. I let Duke out. She gestured toward a lazy old bloodhound sitting on the porch. And he bolted straight for the guy, didn't bark or snarl like he usually does at strangers, just stared at him, gave me the creeps. The Harper's neighbor wasn't the only one who remembered the mysterious man. Across the street, Danielle Warner shared similar suspicions. I clocked him once around midnight, Danielle said, her arms crossed tightly as if shielding herself from the memory. Tall, little bit of a limp, right? I thought he was just a delivery guy at first. Amazon or something, but no package truck, no uniform, just standing there, kind of staring towards the house. I wanted to say something, but I was on my way to bed and I didn't want to get involved. Connecting the dots. As more witness accounts trickled in, a pattern began to emerge. Roger Kane had been seen multiple times near number 14 Poplar Street, often late at night and almost always when Elizabeth Harper was home. He rarely seemed to interact with anyone directly, but what he left behind was an unmistakable air of dread. Detective Laura Grayson's frustration was mounting as they reviewed statements in the command tent later that evening. She sat with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands while Simmons pored over a map spread across the table, marking the neighbors' descriptions of where Kane had been spotted. What's the problem, Laura? Simmons asked, noting her silence. The problem, Grayson sighed, is that all we've got is a ghost with a limp who just so happens to know the Harpers, and oh yeah, just so happens to have been creeping around their house for months before they disappeared. Simmons smirked faintly. You mean Roger Kane? Yes, Roger Kane, Grayson said, the weariness in her voice giving way to irritation. Who keeps popping into this investigation like a bad penny, but conveniently vanishes before we can nail him to anything? The ghost of Roger Kane. Who exactly was Roger Kane? To the detectives, he was more than just Elizabeth Harper's ex-husband. He was the kind of man built on failed promises and broken trust. His rap sheet wasn't extensive, but what was there painted a grim picture. Domestic violence charges against him dismissed after Elizabeth refused to testify, gambling debts tied to shady creditors, and one incident involving forged financial documents that landed him a warning, but no conviction. "Look at this guy," Simmons muttered as he slid Roger's file across the table to Grayson. "Classic sumbitch who thinks the world owes him something, runs his life off charm and cheap cons until the ground falls out beneath him." Grayson leaned back in her chair, scanning the detailed notes. "And the Harper family? They were the last lifeboat he had before he drowned." Roger and Elizabeth's marriage had been turbulent, to say the least, and ended on unpredictable terms. The divorce left Elizabeth emotionally drained and Roger financially destitute. From what they gathered, he blamed her for both. He had borrowed money he couldn't repay, spent what he didn't have, and likely saw Elizabeth as his last chance to fix a sinking ship. But when she refused to take him back, it appeared he turned to manipulation and financial control instead. "And then there's this," Simmons added, lifting a folder marked financial evidence. 5 out of the 9 victims buried in that field, financially connected to Kane. 2 of them worked in the same office Elizabeth did. 1, get this, was a debt collector for a loan company. He literally murdered people tangled up in his money vortex. Grayson didn't respond immediately. She just stared at the file, her stomach turning. The eerie puzzle of the case was finally coming together in threads, but they weren't connected yet. "If he's willing to go that far," she whispered, "it won't end until we stop him." The escape artist. The challenge wasn't just proving Kane's connection to the victims, it was finding him. By the time authorities began investigating the gravesite and tying it back to number 14 Poplar Street, Kane had vanished. Surveillance footage was scant, his known locations amounted to ghost towns, and even his social media, if it ever existed, was scrubbed clean. The first real break came not in Aurora, but miles away in Denver, where a farmer reported giving a lift to a limping man who claimed his car had broken down. He said his name was Joe, the farmer explained to police later. Real polite guy, but there was something, I don't know, jumpy about him, kept checking over his shoulder like he thought someone was after him. What Kane didn't realize was that his nervous energy and sharp features had left an impression. After hearing the local news report about the Aurora crime scene, the farmer called in the tip, and soon enough, patrols across the state were on high alert for Kane's description. "Denver makes sense," Simmons mused, pinning a new dot on the board in the command tent that tracked Kane's possible movements. "Big city, plenty of places to hide if you know what you're doing, but then what? Where does he go from there?" Grayson, who had been silently tapping a pen against the table, finally spoke. "Mexico." Simmons paused, squinting at her. "Mexico? What makes you say that?" "It's seamless," she explained. "He doesn't have a real footprint. No credit cards, no property, no legal ties anymore. If he disappears south of the border, he's as good as gone. But first he'd need a bus or maybe a cheap train ticket. The chase begins." Grayson's hunch was confirmed just days later when another lead came in from a Greyhound bus terminal in El Paso, Texas. Security footage showed Kane purchasing a ticket to Nuevo Laredo. His limp was undeniable, and the grainy video caught a haunting moment as he looked up at the camera, his face distant, but his frozen expression almost daring them to find him. "Pack your bags," Grayson told Simmons after reviewing the footage. "We've got a hunt on our hands." Tracking Roger Kane had vanished, as though the ground swallowed him whole, leaving nothing but questions and a trail so faint it was nearly invisible. For Detective Laura Grayson and her partner Andre Simmons, this wasn't just a manhunt, it was a race against time. If Kane had indeed killed the Harpers and buried those 9 bodies, there was every reason to believe that more lives were at stake, piecing together the puzzle. "It's like he disappeared into thin air," Simmons grumbled, sprawled in his chair at the temporary command post the team set up in Aurora. The whiteboard in front of them was crowded with maps, photos, and hurried notes, every lead they chased now staring back at them with stubborn silence. Grayson leaned over the desk, her fingers resting on a coffee mug she hadn't touched in hours. "Nobody vanishes. Not completely. He left footprints somewhere, we just haven't found them yet." "Footprints," Simmons snorted. "If he's out walking with his damn limp, you'd think someone would have spotted him by now." With a sigh, Grayson flipped through the case files on the table. "We know he's meticulous. He didn't bury 9 bodies in that lot without covering his tracks. He's been ghosting for months, carefully planning every move. But people like Kane, they always slip up eventually, and we need to be ready when he does." I'm a little less optimistic, Simmons admitted, glaring at the board. He jabbed a finger at a blurry photo of Kane from 3 years ago, taken from a background check. This guy's been playing the victim his entire life. Oh, my wife ruined me. Oh, I was pushed too far. He's the type to always justify what he's done. And while we sit here untying 100 knots, he's probably halfway to Canada or Mexico. Grayson straightened. You think Mexico? Wouldn't you? Cuts his losses, crosses the border, and disappears forever. Maybe he's already gone. Grayson shook her head. I don't think he's that far yet. A guy with his ego doesn't just vanish without leaving some parting gifts. Kane's on the move, but he's not done. Not yet. A mysterious lead. The first break came 2 days later, after state and federal alerts were sent out on Kane's description. A small-town farmer outside Denver called in, reporting an unsettling encounter. I gave him a lift. Didn't think much of it at first, the farmer explained to the officer over the phone, his gruff voice crackling through the speaker. He was limping pretty bad, said his car broke down somewhere up the road. The officer pressed further. Did he give you a name? Joe, the farmer replied. Said his name was Joe. Real polite guy, kept thanking me the whole ride, but there was something off about him. Jumpy, kept looking over his shoulder like someone was following him. When asked where he dropped Kane off, the answer gave Grayson a spark of hope. A gas station just outside Denver. It had security cameras. This could be our break, Grayson muttered as they headed out to retrieve the footage. If he's using fake names and relying on cash transactions, we've got limited chances to catch him slipping. But video? That's the kind of thing we can work with. The footage. 20 hours of grainy security camera footage was painstakingly combed through by the team. And then, at the 21st hour, they found him. Kane appeared on screen, his posture heavy but hurried, limping toward a vending machine outside the station. He was wearing a baseball cap low over his face, but the limp was unmistakable. At one point he shot a glance toward the parking lot, eyes scanning nervously before walking inside. There he is, Simmons murmured, tapping the screen. Ballsy move, stopping in plain sight. Grayson wasn't as impressed. Look at his face, he's exhausted. That's not confidence, that's desperation. He's running, but he's slipping. The footage showed Kane at the counter, purchasing a pack of gum and a cheap burner phone. He lingered just long enough to make a call, and then disappeared from view. Can we trace it? Simmons asked, though he already knew the answer. If it's a burner, probably not, Grayson admitted. But this is still a lead. We know he's in Denver, and if he's buying phones... She trailed off, thinking. What? Grayson snapped her fingers. He needs cash, Simmons nodded. Cash means ATMs, and if he makes a withdrawal... Grayson picked up her phone to call the analyst back at the station. Exactly. We cross-reference this timestamp with any ATM withdrawals connected to Kane's known accounts, even side accounts tied to him. A heated search. The ATM withdrawal finally came through less than 2 hours after the gas station sighting. Kane had pulled $500 in cash from a downtown branch. Surveillance from the ATM matched the gas station footage. Same man, same limp, same worn baseball cap. He's staying in Denver, Grayson said, clicking her pen as they sat hunched over the monitors. You don't pull cash like this to leave immediately. He's hunkering down somewhere, deciding his next move. We need boots on the ground, Simmons said firmly. Hotels, motels, shelters, anywhere he could hide. Acting on instinct, Grayson divided the district into quadrants, assigning teams of officers to canvass every budget lodge and rundown building within a 3-mile radius of the ATM. Every front desk clerk got the same photo of Kane, along with specific instructions to report any sign of him immediately. Hours passed with no sign until a rookie officer stationed at a small roadside inn outside the city radioed in. We've got something. The manager says a guy fitting Kane's description checked in 2 nights ago. Room 14, paid in cash. Is he still there? Simmons asked, already grabbing his jacket. The officer hesitated. Unclear. He hasn't been seen since this morning, but the car's still parked outside. Grayson snapped orders quickly. Surround the building. No one goes in until SWAT is in position. If Kane's inside, he's not walking out unless it's in cuffs. The confrontation. The inn was small, with the air of a place long past its prime. Its parking lot held only a handful of cars, one of which matched the description of a vehicle Kane could have stolen weeks earlier from a relative. Grayson and Simmons arrived on scene just as SWAT moved into position. The tension was thick, the kind that crackles through the air before something big happens. Think he's armed? Simmons asked quietly as they surveyed the building. Probably, Grayson replied bluntly. Desperate men with nothing to lose usually are. Minutes stretched like hours as officers moved in, their weapons drawn. The door to room 14 was breached with a resounding crack, and SWAT swept into the room. "Clear!" one voice called out. "Clear!" another echoed. Grayson and Simmons stepped inside moments later, their eyes scanning the space. The room was a mess. Unmade bed, fast food wrappers strewn across the table, an empty suitcase tossed on the floor. But Kane wasn't there. What he did leave behind, though, sent chills up Grayson's spine. Taped to the small mirror above the dresser was a note scrawled in rushed, jagged handwriting. "You're too late. You won't find me." Grayson crumpled the edge of the note in her hand. "Damn it," she hissed. "He's still running." A lead to Texas. What Kane didn't know was that the stolen car outside would give them his next move. A nearby camera at a gas station showed him abandoning the vehicle and boarding a Greyhound bus to Texas. The hunt was far from over. The cold-blooded methods. Every criminal has a signature, a distinctive pattern in how they operate, whether they realize it or not. For Roger Kane, his methods were as cold-blooded as they were deliberate. Each of his actions appeared designed to not just end lives but also to erase them. His crimes followed a chilling logic, a calculated efficiency that left detectives like Laura Grayson and Andre Simmons grappling with the dark mind of a killer who seemed incapable of guilt. Constructing the profile. "This guy doesn't just kill, he annihilates," Grayson said, breaking the silence in the command tent as she sifted through early forensic reports. Her words hung heavily in the air. The entire team, as seasoned as they were, could feel the weight of the case bearing down on them. Simmons let out a slow breath and leaned back in his chair, the creak of the old wood seeming to emphasize the tension in the room. "You're not wrong. Wouldn't call this your run-of-the-mill angry ex. He's doing more than just getting rid of people. He's eliminating obstacles permanently." The freshly compiled autopsy reports filled in some of the grisly blanks. Though many of the bodies were badly decomposed, they still told a story. Dr. Megan Ross, who had been leading the forensic examinations, stepped into the center of the room, her measured tone breaking the grim silence. "So far, the patterns in his methods are consistent across the victims. Blunt trauma to the skull in at least 3 cases, stab wounds in others, precise, almost surgical. And then there's the dismemberment," she added, her voice dropping. Grayson frowned. "Dismemberment?" Ross flipped through her clipboard. "It appears he didn't just bury the victims. He made an effort to ensure the bodies couldn't easily be identified. Arms severed, sometimes heads as well. Tissue samples suggest bleach or another caustic agent was used in some cases to accelerate decomposition. He was trying to destroy evidence." "Christ," Simmons muttered, rubbing a hand across his face. "This isn't just killing, this is erasing people like they were never even here." Grayson's pen tapped rhythmically against the table as she processed the information. What kind of person has it in them to do this? Not once, but over and over. Ross's response was clinical, but it only underscored the horror of the situation. "If I had to guess, someone with a clear motive who views his victims as obstacles or assets. To him, they're disposable." The victims' stories. The forensic evidence painted a horrifying picture, but it was the lives of the victims that humanized the stakes. Each victim, buried in shallow, hastily dug graves, had a name, a story, and tragically, a connection to Roger Kane. 5 of the victims, Simmons pointed out, tracing his finger along their profiles on the whiteboard, had direct financial relationships with Kane. One was a debt collector, another worked at the same law office as Elizabeth Harper. Then there's the young woman who reportedly loaned him money. He targeted people he owed, people who knew too much, or people standing in the way of his plans. "And the Harpers?" Grayson asked quietly, folding her arms as she studied the board. "They were the foundation of his entire scheme." Simmons paused. "Elizabeth probably realized he was forging documents. Dorothy, well, she was his legal link to their money. And Lila, she might have just been in the way." Grayson's jaw clenched. In the way of what? What was he trying so hard to protect? "Control," Simmons replied simply. "Control and survival." The team fell into silence until Simmons broke it with a tired sigh. "And yet, as calculated as he is, his methods also give him away, don't they? I mean, all of this, the graves, the burial sites, the dismemberment. He's careful. But it also shows. This guy isn't just about self-preservation. He's angry, he's desperate." Ross nodded, shuffling through another set of documents. "The dismemberment especially, it's practical, yes, makes disposal easier. But it's also intimate, personal. This isn't someone who kills from a distance. He faced his victims, he made it personal." Grayson's face darkened. "The closer you are, the more control you feel." "The body in the creek." The discoveries near the Harper family home included far more than just graves. One of the most chilling finds came as forensic divers were sent to search a nearby creek. What they pulled from the water was evidence of Kane's ruthlessness and his inhumane methods. "Found this wedged in some rocks about 40 feet downstream," a uniformed officer said grimly as Ross examined the evidence. It was a rusted metal toolbox, its latches secured tightly with duct tape. When it was opened, the contents confirmed everyone's fears. Inside were the remains of yet another victim, dismembered and packed with quicklime, a substance often used to suppress odors and accelerate decomposition. "Jesus," Simmons muttered, as Ross and her team methodically cataloged the gruesome find. His fist tightened at his sides. "He didn't even bury this one, just dumped her." Grayson stared down at the toolbox, the icy anger in her eyes barely contained. This wasn't just about getting rid of her, this was punishment. Ross let out a quiet breath as she reviewed the remains. "The lime didn't work as well as he'd hoped. We might be able to ID her. Teeth are intact, but—" She hesitated, clearly trying to find the right words. "But what?" Grayson prompted. "She suffered," Ross replied softly. "The damage suggests she was alive when the dismemberment began." "God damn him," Simmons growled. "How does someone do that to another human being?" Grayson didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at the crime scene photos spread across the table. Kane's methods weren't just cold-blooded, they were monstrous. The calculated burial sites. Another pattern began to emerge as investigators mapped out the burial sites around Aurora. Each grave was shallow, hastily dug, and isolated. Kane appeared to select locations based on convenience, abandoned lots, wooded areas near creeks, places where it was unlikely anyone would stumble across the remains. "But he wasn't perfect," Simmons pointed out, as the team studied the map. "These sites, yeah, they're remote, but not remote enough. He wanted the bodies gone, but he rushed it. That's why we're finding them now." Grayson nodded. "Rushed or not, there's planning here. He didn't wake up one morning and decide to bury 9 people. He knew where he was going, what he was doing. The question is there more?" Ross set down a folder containing satellite data gleaned from the initial investigation. "If you're asking whether there are more victims out there, the answer is, probably." "Then we can't stop here," Grayson said, her tone as sharp as steel. "If he left even one grave unturned, we need to find it before anyone else gets hurt." The pattern of escalation. The deeper the team dug into Kane's methods, the more they realized they were dealing with a killer who was escalating. His earlier crimes, the forged documents, the quiet manipulations, seemed almost benign compared to the pure brutality of his later murders. "He's spinning out of control," Grayson said during one late-night briefing. "What started as financial exploitation morphed into something much darker, and the longer he gets away with it, the bolder he'll become." "So what happens now?" Simmons asked, leaning forward. "Where does a guy like this go from here?" Grayson didn't hesitate with her answer. "He keeps killing until we stop him." A long and desperate escape for Roger Kane. Staying one step ahead of the law wasn't just about survival, it was about control. Every choice he made as he fled across state lines wasn't impulsive, it was calculated. And though his face was now splashed across newspapers, TV stations, and law enforcement bulletins, he seemed to always stay just out of reach, like a shadow slipping through the cracks. And the chase begins. "This bastard is slippery, I'll give him that," Simmons muttered, tossing another lead folder onto the growing pile on his desk at the temporary command center. Grayson was still staring at a map tacked to the wall, circling Denver and its outskirts. "He's not just slippery," she replied, her voice sharp as steel. "He's survival-focused. He knows how to stay below the radar. He's got enough street smarts to compartmentalize his movements. Every city he stays in is just a stopgap for his end goal." "And that end goal is—" Simmons raised an eyebrow. Grayson tapped her pen against the word Mexico scrawled in black ink across the lower corner of the map. "That's where I'd bet he's headed. He can disappear there. No extradition if he goes deep enough. It's what people like Kane do. They slide into the cracks someplace south of the border, start a new life and lose their old one." Simmons leaned forward in his chair. "You think he's planning that far ahead?" Grayson glanced at him. "What do you think this entire crime spree was about to begin with? Planning. He calculated the forgeries, the murders, his alibis. That's not the kind of guy who panics and wings it. He's moving fast, but he knows exactly where he's going." The early days of the escape. The first major sighting after Kane left Aurora came from a Greyhound bus terminal 3 days after the gravesite discovery. "He's on the move," Simmons said, gesturing to grainy footage captured at a station in El Paso, Texas. On screen, Kane walked with his signature limp, a baseball cap pulled low over his face as he purchased a one-way ticket to Albuquerque. His body language betrayed him. He looked tense, his movements hurried. "What's he carrying there?" Grayson asked, squinting at the footage. "Looks like a duffel bag," Simmons replied. "Probably everything he's got left. Cash, burner phones, maybe food if he's smart." Grayson tilted her head. "He's not just hunkering down in one place, he's zigzagging, throwing us off his trail." Simmons sighed. "Great. The guy's playing connect the dots with bus stations." The detectives scrambled the local authorities in Albuquerque, but were too late. By the time they arrived at the station, Kane was already gone. Witnesses said he'd boarded another bus, destination unknown. This became a trend. He was always just ahead, leaving behind only vague descriptions from passers-by. Tall man, slight limp, kept to himself. Changing faces, changing names. By the second week of the manhunt, it became clear that Kane wasn't just running. He was adapting. His known appearances grew scarcer. Witnesses described him differently each time. In one instance, he was a quiet loner calling himself Joe Harper. In another, he used the name Dale Rivers and claimed to be hitchhiking to visit family. He dyed his hair darker. He ditched his usual baseball cap for a wide-brimmed cowboy hat that obscured his features. He was a chameleon, systematically dismantling whatever identity could tie him to the crimes in Aurora. "Sick son of a bitch," Simmons muttered as they reviewed interviews with people who'd crossed paths with Kane. "He wants to disappear," Grayson said simply. "Think about it. No family, no true connections, and no digital footprint. It's his ultimate erasure." "But he's not just erasing himself," Simmons added, flipping through the forensics file on the Harper family. "He's erasing the last people who had any hold over him, mentally or financially." The smugglers and the border tracking Kane's movements westward brought fresh complications. By the third week, scattered intel suggested he'd made contact with smugglers operating along the southern border. "This is where he gets dangerous," Grayson said during a late-night briefing. "If he gets in with a crew running illegals or contraband over the border, we lose him. They're not just going to help him disappear, they're going to make sure nobody ever finds him again." The task force expanded. Law enforcement near border cities like El Paso, Tucson, and Laredo were brought in. Greyhound stations and cheap motels in those areas were monitored more closely than ever before. Still, Kane had an uncanny ability to vanish just as their net tightened. "One step ahead every damn time," Simmons said, half growling as another search ended up empty. "It's the people he connects with," Grayson said. "He knows how to latch onto the types who'll help him without asking questions. Then he dumps them the second they aren't useful anymore." An anonymous tip eventually confirmed that Kane had tried negotiating with Coyotes, a small-time smuggling ring that helped undocumented migrants cross the Texas border. But the deal went sour. "Guess that limp of his made him stand out a little too much," Simmons speculated after reading the report. "And now he's got fewer options," Grayson added. "Every failed deal means more heat on him. The question is, what does he do when he's cornered?" The mistake. For weeks, Kane had been meticulous, careful, enough to frustrate even the most calculating detectives. But desperation breeds mistakes, and eventually, even the most careful fugitives slip. That slip came at a gas station outside Corpus Christi. Kane, too low on cash to avoid using an ATM, made a withdrawal tied to one of his old accounts. It was a bold move, a desperate move, and it was exactly what the detectives needed. Grayson practically jumped out of her chair when the report hit their desk. "We've got him!" The ATM footage showed Kane even more disheveled than before. His limp was worse, perhaps from the strain of weeks of moving non-stop. He looked thinner, gaunt even. His face, usually hardened with determination, looked worn down, his eyes darting anxiously toward the camera. "This guy's running out of steam," Simmons commented as they reviewed the footage. "That's what desperation does," Grayson replied. "He's got no safe houses left, no more easy exits. He's running on borrowed time." The final stand with the Corpus. Christie sighting narrowing the window, Grayson and Simmons coordinated a sweeping operation across nearby towns and bus terminals. It was only a matter of time now. The picture of Roger Kane was becoming clearer. Each subsequent sighting revealed a man pushed further to his limits. His calculated, ice-cold demeanor was cracking. He was a hunter who had become the hunted. Finally, nearly 2 months after the manhunt began, the tip that broke the case came through. A motel manager at a dingy roadside inn in Laredo recognized Kane from photos distributed to the area's local law enforcement. "I knew it was him the second he started limping to the vending machine," the manager later told reporters. "I saw the news about his crimes. Called the cops as soon as he went back to his room. When the SWAT team finally stormed the room, Kane's attempt at resistance was fleeting, a jagged steak knife clutched in one hand as his body sagged against the wall in defeat. The long escape was over. Grayson stood outside the motel as Kane was dragged out in cuffs, his once empty eyes now filled with anger and exhaustion. For her, this wasn't victory, it was closure for the victims. "You thought you could run forever," she murmured under her breath. "But everyone leaves a trail, even you." The shocking confession. Roger Kane sat in the cramped interrogation room, his wrists shackled to the metal table. The dull hum of the overhead fluorescent light buzzed faintly, its glare bouncing off the cold walls. He looked different now, hollowed, thinner, and worn down by weeks on the run. His signature arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind a bitter man filled with quiet defiance. Detective Laura Grayson sat across from him, her eyes sharp, calculating. She offered no pleasantries, no false kindness. There was only one job left for her, to make him talk, breaking the silence. "You've made quite the mess, Kane," Grayson said, her voice calm but charged with authority. She tapped her pen lightly against her notepad, keeping steady eye contact. 9 bodies in an overgrown lot and a wild goose chase across 3 states. Hell of a legacy. Roger's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the table like he was trying to weigh his options. He wasn't going to start talking, not yet at least. Simmons leaned casually against the far wall, his arms crossed as he watched the tension build. "Don't bother pretending, we've got enough evidence to bury you without a trial." His tone was less measured, more antagonistic. "But maybe these families deserve to know. Why'd you do it? Why the Harpers? Why them?" Roger's lips twitched, but he said nothing. Grayson leaned forward, her eyes boring into his. She lowered her voice to a near whisper, making the words cut sharper. "Was it control, Roger? They slipped out of it, didn't they? Elizabeth divorced you, Dorothy refused to give up the house, and Lila... What did she do? Did she see something she wasn't supposed to? Or did you just hate the sight of them trying to get away from you?" Roger's head jerked up at that, his lips curled into a bitter sneer. "You don't know a damn thing about me." "Then make me understand," Grayson countered coolly. "Because I'll be the first to tell the jury exactly how much of a coward you are if you let them write this story for you." The confession begins. For nearly 10 minutes the room was suffocatingly silent. Roger shifted uncomfortably against the hard chair, his cuffed hands twitching on the table. Finally he exhaled sharply, his tone laced with bitterness and exhaustion. "You think this was easy for me? You think I wanted it to come to this?" Simmons scoffed. 9 people in shallow graves seemed to say otherwise." Roger glared at him, but the heat in his eyes softened as he turned to Grayson. "You don't get it, none of you do. They pushed me, they wouldn't stop. Every time I tried to fix things, they made it worse." Grayson didn't flinch. She leaned back in her chair, giving him room to unravel. "You've got our attention, Roger. Go ahead, tell us how you're the victim here." "Elizabeth," he began, his voice cracking slightly. He swallowed hard. "She ruined me. That divorce, it wasn't just about splitting up. She took everything. My reputation, my business, my stability. She told everyone it was my fault, that I was some goddamn monster. But I took care of her. I gave her everything. And she threw me away like garbage." Grayson tilted her head slightly. "So you thought killing her would fix that? That it would make up for your bruised ego?" Roger slammed his fists against the table, the chains rattling loudly. "She wasn't supposed to fight me on the house. We had a deal!" His voice echoed in the tiny room, raw and trembling. "She wouldn't let me stay with her when everything fell apart. I begged her and she slammed the door in my face. Dorothy, that old witch was in her ear, poisoning her against me. And Lila, she just wanted to keep the peace, but she found out too much." Simmons stepped forward now, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Found out what, Roger? You mean the forgeries, the life insurance scams? Don't act like this was some noble crusade. You were stealing from them." Roger's face contorted into anger, then something resembling shame. He ran his hands through his disheveled hair and leaned heavily on the table. "I was desperate," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "The debts, they don't just go away. Those people I owed money to, they don't take no for an answer. I was drowning, and no one cared. Not Elizabeth, not Dorothy, no one. The murders. And that's where the bodies pile up, right?" Grayson pressed, maintaining her calm exterior even as her blood boiled underneath. 9 people, 9 lives. Did each one of them back you into a corner too?" "It wasn't supposed to go that far," Roger muttered, his voice hollow. "Elizabeth was first. She told me she was going to the cops when she found out about the paperwork I forged. I couldn't let her do that. I just snapped. And Dorothy? Simmons asked, his voice sharper now. She was a liability after Elizabeth, Roger admitted bitterly, staring down at the table as though speaking to his own guilt. She would have gone to the police too. She wouldn't even look me in the eye, just kept calling me a failure. I saw it in her face. She thought I was scum. It wasn't fair. None of this was fair. And Lila? Grayson asked softly. What about the woman you helped raise? What did she do to deserve being one of your little liabilities? Roger's face twisted. His breaths grew shallow and quick. Lila, she was different. She tried to run. She heard Dorothy and me yelling one night. I don't even know if she knew everything, but she panicked. She was packing. I couldn't let her leave. He paused, choking on his words as if they were too awful to say out loud. She would have told someone. And the others? Simmons demanded, his hand slamming against the wall. What about the other 6 victims you left to rot in that lot? What about them, Roger? Roger finally looked back at Simmons, his eyes rimmed with desperation. They were mistakes, loose ends, people who were owed money, people who could tie me to something. Elizabeth, Dorothy, Lila. They were personal, but the others, I didn't have a choice. Grayson's hands clenched around her pen, but her voice remained steady. You had a choice, every time. You chose every one of those shallow graves over facing the consequences. The final words. For a moment Roger looked like he might break. His rigid shoulders sagged and his breath came in short gasps. He wasn't defiant anymore. He wasn't even angry. For the first time he looked afraid. I never wanted to hurt them, he said, almost whispering. I just couldn't let them ruin me. I had nothing left. Grayson leaned in, her voice sharp like the blade of a knife. No, Roger, they didn't ruin you, you did. But now you don't get to run anymore. The room fell into silence, the weight of his confession pressing down on everyone like a suffocating blanket. Grayson stood and gestured for the officers outside. As they came in to escort Kane back to his holding cell, Simmons spoke up one last time. Enjoy the trial, he said bitterly. The victims don't get to rest, but at least they'll get justice. As Roger was dragged away in cuffs, Grayson leaned against the table and exhaled deeply. 9 lives, she murmured, her voice trembling slightly now that the interrogation was over. An entire family wiped out because of his greed and pride. We got him, Simmons said, his tone firm. 9 graves, and it's over now. Yeah, Grayson replied, though the hollow ache in her gut said the damage could never truly be undone. Justice served. The courtroom was packed. Pews that would normally sit empty for mundane hearings were now filled with reporters, victims' families, and curious members of the public. The trial of Roger Kane became one of the most highly anticipated legal proceedings in Colorado's history. It wasn't just a chance to unravel Kane's heinous story, it was an opportunity for justice to speak for the 9 victims who no longer could. Detective Laura Grayson sat quietly in the back, observing the process unfold as a small measure of closure started to form, though it would always feel incomplete. Next to her, Detective Andre Simmons leaned back, his arms crossed tightly as if holding back the frustration that had brewed over months of chasing Kane. Crazy how it all plays out, huh? Simmons said under his breath. Grayson didn't respond immediately. Her sharp eyes were fixed on Kane, who sat stone-faced at the defendant's table, wearing an ill-fitting suit that clashed with his gaunt features. His signature arrogance was still there, but it had dimmed. After weeks in custody, the predator who had run 3 states ahead of them looked smaller, broken even. Life has a way of cornering people like him, Grayson muttered eventually. He spent so much time running, killing, thinking he was untouchable. Now, it's all catching up. The trial begins. The case against Roger Kane was airtight. Over weeks of testimony, the prosecution laid out a damning narrative pieced together from forensic evidence, witness accounts, and Kane's own confession. Each victim's story unfolded, a life taken too soon, a name that was no longer just one of 9 statistics but a person with hopes, dreams, and families who were now left in pieces. All eyes turned to District Attorney Ellen Calloway as she stood to deliver her opening statement. Known for her sharp wit and determined approach, Calloway rose like she had already won the trial. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, her voice echoing through the silent room. What you are about to hear over the coming weeks is not just a story of violence, it's a story of greed, a story of control, a story that leaves no doubt about the guilt of the man sitting before you today, she said, turning slightly to point at Kane. His eyes burned with defiance, but he didn't flinch. When Calloway laid out the sequence of murders, the room felt like it dropped 10 degrees. The jury squirmed in their seats as she described the victim's final moments. These weren't spur-of-the-moment acts. Roger Kane planned each one meticulously. He chose his victims, silenced them when they threatened to expose him, and buried their bodies in plots of land where he thought no one would ever find them. That's not the act of desperation. It's the cold, calculated work of a man who thought he was smarter than all of us. The witnesses speak. Grayson herself eventually took the stand, her presence striking a balance between professionalism and authenticity. Her testimony focused on the investigation, the mountain of evidence discovered in Aurora, and the relentless efforts of her team to capture Kane before he could hurt anyone else. She recounted in excruciating detail the grisly discovery of 9 shallow graves behind the lot near the Harper home. She described the emotional toll of unraveling Kane's network of lies, tracking his movements and ultimately confronting his crimes. "What did you think when you first heard his name connected to this case?" the prosecutor asked. Grayson paused before answering. That he wouldn't stop. He wasn't running to escape the law. He was running to keep killing. The room was silent, except for the sounds of the court reporter's fingers clicking away at her keyboard. Kane's defense attempted to paint him differently. They clung to an unsubstantial claim of mental duress, arguing that Kane's spiral into violence was caused by mounting debts, emotional hardship, and a life falling apart. But the jury saw right through it. Each piece of evidence stacked against him left no room for sympathy. The verdict: Grayson and Simmons were present every day of the proceedings. They owed that to the victims and their families, many of whom now sat just a few rows ahead of them. Karen Blake, the jogger who discovered the smell that morning on Quincy Lane, was there too, her face still pale like she was reliving that moment every time it was mentioned. It took the jury just under 6 hours to deliberate before filing back into the courtroom. Everyone held their breath as the foreperson stood to read the verdict. "On the charge of first-degree murder," the foreperson said, her voice calm but loud enough to reach the back of the room, "we find the defendant Roger Kane guilty." Grayson and Simmons exchanged a glance, not celebratory but heavy with relief. The families seated in the front rows broke into tears, some clinging to each other, others mouthing words of thanks toward the detectives who had worked tirelessly for months. Kane showed no reaction, his jaw tightening as he stared straight ahead. But it wasn't over yet. The sentence. The sentencing phase stirred even more emotion. Families of the victims were invited to speak about the impact Kane's crimes had left on their lives. Mothers, brothers, and spouses stood trembling at the podium, their voices cracking as they recounted the loss of their loved ones. One by one, their words painted a picture of the immeasurable grief Kane had inflicted, not just on the victims but on entire communities. "He took my sister. She was just 25 years old. She helped everybody, and for what? Because he thought she was in his way?" one family member said, clutching a framed photo of the young woman who had been reduced to evidence in the police files. When it was time for Kane to speak, he declined. His once defiant posture was slumped, his silence speaking louder than any statement he could have made. Grayson couldn't help but study him. His empty gaze wasn't regretful. It wasn't even sad. It was hollow. He wasn't processing the devastation, the pain. He was simply calculating what was next. But this time, there were no moves left. The judge, a weathered man with decades on the bench, delivered Kane's sentence in a voice as resolute as the justice system itself. "Roger Kane," he began, staring directly into the defendant's tired but cold eyes. "The court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No appeals will undo the suffering you caused. Justice will live where your victims' voices cannot." From the back row, Simmons leaned toward Grayson, whispering, "Not the death penalty, huh? Honestly, life might be worse. He'll rot in a cage." Grayson nodded slightly. "Let him sit there and think about every single person he took away. That'll be his punishment. The aftermath." The Harper house had been abandoned long before the trial even started, its eerie presence now permanently marked by the memories of what had unfolded within its walls. On the surface, Quincy Lane and Aurora tried to restore some semblance of normalcy. Neighbors returned to their routines, joggers frequented the streets again, and families hosted block parties in an effort to reclaim their peace. Yet the lingering weight of the murders cast a shadow that no amount of time could fully erase. Simmons and Grayson met one final time to close out the case officially. "So," Simmons asked over his usual cup of bad coffee, "how does it feel now, knowing Kane's locked away for good?" Grayson stared out the window, watching as the clouds rolled lazily across the Colorado sky. "It feels like closure," she said finally. "But not peace, not for the families. We got justice. That's all we can offer them, but it'll never bring them back." Simmons tapped his fingers on the counter thoughtfully before standing. "You did right by them, Laura, 9 lives, but you gave their stories a voice." Grayson sighed and nodded. "Let's hope that's enough." Lessons learned from the case. The Roger Kane serial murder case was more than just a series of gruesome crimes. It was a rare, almost textbook example of how greed, manipulation, and unchecked anger can spiral into one of the most horrific acts of violence a community ever endures. Aurora, Colorado, a place once known for its serenity and neighborly simplicity, had become the backdrop for a nightmare no one would soon forget. For detectives Laura Grayson and Andre Simmons, the case was a lesson they wouldn't allow themselves to ignore. It was a reminder of the fragility of trust, the glaring signals that often go unnoticed, and the devastating cost of turning a blind eye. But it was also about more than the failures. It was about justice, resilience, and finding light in even the darkest corners. The danger of overlooking red flags. Grayson sat at her desk late one evening, long after most of her colleagues had gone home. The case files were still open, the haunting photos staring back at her like inked memories she couldn't rewrite. Simmons, standing by the coffee machine, watched her with quiet concern. "They called him a quiet man," Grayson murmured, her voice low as she flipped through her notes. "Even Elizabeth described him that way." At first, Simmons leaned against the counter, shaking his head. "Quiet doesn't mean harmless. Hell, sometimes the quiet ones are the loudest when it comes to violence." "Exactly," Grayson said, exhaling sharply. "But why didn't anyone ask the hard questions earlier?" Elizabeth's friends knew about the abuse. Her neighbors heard shouting late at night, saw Kane lurking around the Harper house. Nobody stepped in. Nobody pushed back against him. Why? "They probably figured it wasn't their business," Simmons said bluntly. His tone wasn't dismissive, it was bitter. "You know how it goes. People stay out of other people's lives until it spills over into theirs." Grayson tapped her pen against her desk. "Maybe so, but this case proves something, Andre. Abuse doesn't stay in the shadows. It grows. When people, institutions, even loved ones ignore the signs, predators like Kane thrive." Simmons nodded grimly. "We let silence protect monsters, that much is clear. The financial web, how greed turns deadly. The financial motivators in Kane's crimes were another glaring lesson, one that would ripple far beyond the courtroom. From the forged life insurance policies to the coercive control of the Harper estate, money had been the fuel that burned Kane's humanity to ash. "This wasn't just about the murders," Grayson said during a debriefing with her team weeks after the trial. She stood at the front of the room pointing to a slideshow showing a web of financial connections between Kane and his victims. "This was about a man who treated people like assets, not family, not friends, but pieces on a game board." Simmons chimed in from his spot near the door. "You look at that and you realize something. Kane wasn't some chaotic killer, he was systematic. Everyone he interacted with had a dollar sign attached to their name in his mind." Grayson gestured toward one slide listing the victims and their connections to Kane. Elizabeth, his ex-wife, wasn't just the woman who left him, she was the owner of the Harper house. Dorothy wasn't just a mother-in-law, she was the key holder to their family's wealth. And Lila, she was an innocent. She probably didn't even understand what was happening until it was too late. One of the rookie detectives raised her hand. "Do you think it was only about the money? I mean, doesn't this seem personal too?" "Oh, it was personal," Grayson agreed, her voice tightening, "but money was his leverage. It gave him power, control. And to people like Kane, power is everything." The role of community in preventing tragedy. Aurora may never have been able to stop Roger Kane entirely, but Grayson believed their community, like so many others, had missed chances to intervene. Sitting with Simmons at a diner weeks later, she stared out the window, watching families laugh and joke as they headed down the sidewalks. Simmons, flipping through a dog-eared menu, didn't seem to notice her drifting thoughts until she spoke. "You ever wonder," she asked softly, "how much of this could have been prevented?" Simmons paused mid-flip. "Prevented how? You're thinking someone should have stopped him before he started killing." "Exactly," Grayson nodded. "How many opportunities were lost because of indifference? People heard Elizabeth fighting with him, people saw him stalking her, manipulating her family, and what did they do? Nothing." "Can't blame him entirely," Simmons said, though his tone carried no conviction. "We live in a world where everyone's so caught up in their own crap, they don't want to stick their necks out for strangers." "That's the problem," Grayson snapped, suddenly angry. "Apathy lets predators grow bolder. Your neighbors aren't just strangers. They're people who need you in ways they'll never say out loud." Simmons studied her for a moment before setting his menu down. So what's the fix, Laura? You think we need more suspicion? More people calling 911 every time someone raises their voice? No, Grayson replied after a moment of thought. I think we need to stop brushing things off. You see a woman with bruises? Ask if she's okay. You hear screaming next door? Check in. It's not about suspicion, it's about decency. Simmons remained silent, but the somber look on his face said everything. Justice is only one step for the Harper family. Justice had come too late. The courtroom verdict gave closure, but it didn't erase the pain left behind by Kane's actions. Grayson frequently found herself thinking about Lila in particular, how young she had been, how senseless her death felt. She had her whole life ahead of her, Grayson confessed to Simmons one day in the briefing room. College, a career, maybe even her own family someday. Kane didn't just kill a person, he destroyed an entire future. And that's what all these families will have to live with, Simmons added grimly. They can tell themselves this guy's rotting in a cell, but when the birthdays and anniversaries roll around, that monster will still take up space in their lives. Grayson sighed. That's why these cases stick with us, Andre. A guilty verdict isn't enough to make them whole again, but it's all we can give, all we can promise. And maybe, Simmons said, his voice softening, next time someone will catch the red flags, maybe this case changes something. What Aurora taught the world. If there was one indelible lesson left behind by the Roger Kane case, it was this: evil thrives in silence. Whether it's the silence of a community ignoring red flags, or the silence of victims trapped by fear, indifference is the ally of every predator. Remember this, Grayson told a class of trainees during a guest lecture months after the trial. Roger Kane didn't start out as a man burying bodies in the woods. He started as a manipulator, a liar, and an abuser. The signs were there. He left 100 threads of warning before anyone realized what he was. And by then, it was too late. As the room hung on to her every word, she leaned forward, lowering her voice like she was sharing a hard truth. Your job as future detectives isn't just solving crimes, it's about breaking the cycle before murder happens, before someone like Kane thinks they can destroy lives without consequence. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. Evil grows in quiet places. It's your job to shine a light.